When people talk about Japanese aviation in World War II, they often focus on the Zero, the plane that stunned the world in the early months of the Pacific War. But the Zero was only as deadly as the men who flew it. Japan's elite fighter aces were some of the most skilled pilots of the entire war. They fought at Pearl Harbor, in the Solomons, over Burma, the Philippines, Taiwan, Okinawa, and across the Pacific. These were men like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Tetsuza Iwamoto, Takeo Okumura, and dozens of others whose names were famous within wartime Japan. They shaped the early success of the Imperial Navy and Army Air Forces. Their victories were celebrated in newspapers and propaganda broadcasts. Young boys memorized their exploits. Their families saw them as heroes. Their squadrons treated them like older brothers. But when Japan surrendered in 1945, everything changed. Aviation was banned. Their planes were destroyed. Their ranks were erased. Their skills became useless in a country no longer allowed to fly military aircraft. Many returned home to shattered cities, burned neighborhoods, food shortages, and families who barely survived the war. So what happened to Japan's fighter aces after World War II? How did they rebuild their lives? What did they carry from the war? And how did they adapt to a nation that had moved from militarism to peace almost overnight? The stories reveal how individuals who once held extraordinary roles faced the ordinary challenges of survival and reinvention in the post-war world. Chapter 1. The Last Flights and the Shock of Defeat in the Final Months of the War. Japan's fighter aces were fighting on fumes. Their squadrons were depleted. Their planes were outclassed by newer American fighters. Training standards for replacement pilots had collapsed. Fuel shortages made flying difficult. Many aces were ordered to lead inexperienced pilots who barely understood basic maneuvers. Some aces died in the last battles. Others were injured. Many watched their friends disappear into clouds of gunfire or lose control in burning aircraft. When the Emperor announced surrender on the 15th of August 1945, the shock was overwhelming. Many pilots had expected to die in battle. Few had imagined a future where Japan stopped fighting entirely. Some aces wept openly. Others sat in silence. A few felt relief that they and their remaining comrades had survived. But almost all felt that the world they had dedicated their youth to had suddenly vanished. Their next challenge was to go home. Chapter 2. Returning to a ruined country for Japan's elite pilots. Returning home was often more painful than combat. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya had been reduced to ashes. Neighborhoods they remembered from childhood were gone. Families lived in temporary shelters or cramped rooms in damaged buildings. Food was scarce. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Jobs were limited. Pilots who had once flown thousands of feet above the Pacific, who had commanded respect and admiration, now found themselves standing in ration lines. Some had to take trains through destroyed stations. Others walked miles on foot because transportation was unreliable. The people waiting at home had also changed. Parents looked older. Siblings were thin from malnutrition. Some had died in air raids. The war had taken its toll on everyone. Pilots faced an uncomfortable truth. Society had no place for them anymore. Chapter 3. The end of aviation in post-war Japan. One of the most dramatic changes after the surrender was the total ban on aircraft production and flight. The Allied occupation prohibited Japan from having a military. Civilian aviation was heavily restricted. No one was allowed to fly. For fighter aces, this was devastating. Flying had been their life. Their training began in their teens. Their identity was tied to the cockpit. Their skill in the air was what made them valuable. Now flying was impossible. Their skills were useless. Their logbooks, once sources of pride, were reminders of a past they could not revisit. Some pilots burned their uniforms. Others hid their flight badges in drawers. A few kept photographs as their only remaining connection to their wartime life. Their new reality required complete reinvention. Chapter 4. The struggle to adapt. Japan's fighter aces tried many different paths after the war. Some succeeded. Many struggled. Their experiences varied, but common patterns emerged. Manual labor and factory work with few jobs available. Many pilots took whatever work they could find. They, Fumti repaired machinery, Fundi built roads, Fundi worked in small factories, Fundi unloaded cargo. At docks, Fumdi labored on farms. These jobs were physically demanding and paid very little. For men who once flew some of the most advanced aircraft in the world, the adjustment was difficult. Becoming teachers or civil servants, a number of aces had enough education to become school teachers or work in local government. They taught mathematics, science, or physical education, often quietly avoiding any mention of their wartime past. Working in transportation, some pilots found work driving buses, taxis, or trucks. The skills were not the same, but the sense of motion offered a faint echo of flying. Total displacement, a few aces fell into alcoholism or poverty. Trauma and survivor's guilt were common. Those who had lost many comrades carried heavy emotional burdens. Many avoided talking about the war entirely. They felt that society no longer wanted to hear their stories. Chapter 5. The Rebirth of Aviation and New Opportunities. The ban on aviation did not last forever. In the early 1950s, as the Cold War intensified, the United States encouraged Japan to rebuild a defensive military structure. This led to the creation of the Japan Self-Defense Forces, the introduction of aircraft manufacturing Thuvian, flight training for new aviation companies, and airlines. Suddenly, former aces had opportunities again. But the timing was mixed. Many were already middle-aged, some had long moved on from flying, others were unable to pass medical requirements. Still, a handful of pilots successfully re-entered aviation. Chapter 6. The aces who returned to the air. Some of Japan's most skilled wartime pilots eventually found their way back into the cockpit. Saburo Sakai, one of the most famous aces. Sakai survived the war despite severe injuries. After years of hardship, he helped build a new company and later became a lecturer on peace and aviation history. He flew again in civilian aircraft during his later years. Tetsushi Iwamoto kept detailed diaries of his wartime experiences. But he struggled emotionally after the war. He worked in small businesses and mechanics jobs before dying young in 1955. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, known as Japan's top ace. Nishizawa died in 1944 before the war ended. His wife later worked in modest jobs, while raising their children alone. Takeo Okumura, one of the later war Navy aces. Okumura did not survive the final battles. His surviving family faced poverty during the occupation. Army aces. Many Army pilots who survived took up work in civilian industries or became part of early aviation revival programs. Some taught future pilots. Once the Japan Air Self-Defense Force formed, these examples illustrate a larger pattern. Aces who survived often lived quiet, modest lives, far removed from their wartime fame. Chapter 7. Reintegration into civilian society. For most aces, the real challenge was not finding work. It was rebuilding their identity. During the war, they were treated as national heroes. Newspapers printed their kill counts. Their units praised them during ceremonies. They received gifts from civilians. Their uniforms symbolized pride and prestige. After the war, Japan embraced peace. Military achievements were no longer celebrated. Wartime heroism became associated with militarism, something the new Japan wanted to distance itself from. Aces had to reshape who they were at a deep emotional level. Some struggled with guilt. They wondered whether they had contributed to suffering. Others felt abandoned by the country that had once celebrated them. A few felt resentment toward the new government. Many simply accepted the change and tried to live quietly. Their silence reflected the silence of post-war Japan, where discussing the war openly was often discouraged. Chapter 8. Advocates for peace. Not all aces disappeared into private life. A number became vocal advocates for peace. Their experiences in the air had made them acutely aware of the cost of war. Saburo Sakai, in particular, spoke repeatedly about the value of peace. He met with former American pilots and formed friendships, with men he had once fought in dogfights over the Pacific. Other pilots participated in veterans groups, wrote memoirs, or contributed to museums and historical research. Their testimonies helped historians understand the realities of aerial combat from the Japanese perspective. These former aces became important voices in Japan's post-war reflection process. Chapter 9. The Aces and Their Families. The war affected not just the pilots, but also the people they returned home to. Marriage and family life. Many aces married soon after returning from the war. Their wives often helped them navigate emotional scars and economic hardship. Some families remained close-knit. Others struggled due to trauma, financial stress, and silence about the past. Children of aces. The children of Japanese fighter aces grew up in a society that valued peace over military history. Many learned about their father's achievements only later in life. Some were shocked to discover that their quiet, modest fathers had once been elite pilots. Late recognition. Only in the 1970s, 1980s, and beyond did Japanese society begin discussing its wartime aviation history more openly. Families attended reunions. Children read their fathers' diaries. Historians published biographies that brought attention back to pilots whose stories had been overshadowed. The families of aces became caretakers of memory, preserving a part of history that could have easily vanished. Chapter 10. The aces who never returned home. Not all aces lived to see the end of the war. Many died during combat missions over the Pacific, often burned in their aircraft or lost at sea. Some were killed during the final air battles defending Okinawa and Kyushu. Others died on suicide missions when the Air Force turned to desperate tactics. For their families, the post-war years were filled with grief and uncertainty. Some never received bodies or personal belongings. They rebuilt their lives with the quiet dignity common across post-war Japan, carrying the memory of husbands, sons, and brothers who never returned. These families represent another dimension of the ace story, one shaped by absence rather than survival. Chapter 11. Legacy in Modern Japan Today. Japan's fighter aces hold a complicated place in history. They were extraordinary pilots whose skills were undeniable. They were also part of a war that caused immense suffering. Their stories reflect both technical mastery and the tragic direction of wartime Japan. Contributions to aviation history. Many aces left behind diaries, notes, or memoirs. Their accounts provide valuable insight into FUFT, aerial combat siphon tactics, used during zero missions, life inside fighter units, the emotional impact of war. Their writings help historians understand aviation from a human perspective. Shift in national memory. Japan's focus on peace means that wartime aviation is not celebrated, but it is studied respectfully. Museums document the technical history of aircraft. Books examine the pilot's personal experiences. Former aces are often remembered for their humility and advocacy for peace rather than their victory counts. Cultural interest. Younger generations learn about them through documentaries, interviews, and historical studies. Their stories remind people how individuals navigate turbulent times and how trauma and resilience can exist side by side. The legacy of Japan's fighter aces is defined not just by their wartime skill, but by their post-war humanity. The story of Japan's elite fighter aces after World War II is a story of transformation. Men who once dominated the skies returned to a country where flying was banned, militarism was rejected, and survival required new skills and a new identity. Some adapted quickly, others struggled quietly. A few regained their place in aviation. Many lived modest lives far from their wartime fame. A number became advocates for peace, using their experiences to warn future generations about the cost of war. Their journey reflects Japan's broader transformation after 1945, from destruction to reconstruction, from militarism to peace, from glory in the clouds to humility on the ground. These pilots carried memories that only those who fought in the skies can understand. Yet they rebuilt their lives with the same determination they once brought to combat, helping shape the peaceful Japan that emerged after the war.